We all come to college with a really idealized view. So we think that because we've, gotten to this sort of like ivory tower of academia, that also is relevant to sort of our personal lives and to our morals, and people are, not only smart people but good people at these schools, and that's not always the case.
President Obama created a new task force to focus more attention on the problem of sexual assault on college campuses. At the same time, the White House released a report that says college women are at greater risk than ever before.
Time magazine reports this week that nearly 1 in 5 college women have been victims.
The White House released guidelines yesterday on how to best combat what can surely be called a sexual assault epidemic on college campuses.
The nationwide outcry about sexual assault on college campuses.
Across the country, there's been a steady drumbeat of college students protesting what they call a lack of attention to sexual assaults on campuses.
People may be not ready to name what happened to them or may not know how to name what happened to them as sexual assault. I think we don't really teach people that their experiences fit under that legal definition, and people may not be able to identify with that and may think, oh, this is something that happens to someone else, or my experience wasn't that bad, it's not really sexual assault, I can't really report this, when really most of the time those things absolutely could be reported.
I met another student, we started dating. The first time that we hooked up, it was consensual for part of it, and then he raped me. And I didn't really view it that way, I think because it didn't fit into this very neat narrative, like of what rape is. It wasn't the person jumping out of the bushes.
The typical sort of narrative, I think, is that we are expecting a perpetrator to be someone who still jumps out of the bushes.
A stranger jumping out from behind the bushes.
A strange black man jumping out of the bushes or the alleyway.
We need to steer away from the stranger sexual assault narrative, because that does happen to people. I'm not saying it doesn't. But a lot of it is someone you know. And it's really hard for someone to think that, oh, well, they're a nice guy and they assaulted me, because that they can be both. My assaulter was both.
Well, we were drinking, obviously, and I was underage at the time, so I went downstairs to sleep, and the next thing I remember is waking up to him on top of me. The first thing I thought was like, well, why is this happening? How could he do this? I tried to push him off me, subtly, make it known that I'm awake. And then he realized that I was awake. He goes, oh shit, shh, it's okay. And I don't know why he would say that in that moment. I know that he was drunk too. I sort of tensed up and then started saying no, and he didn't listen, and then I stopped saying anything at all. The next day, I actually don't know how I had the bravery to do it, but I confronted him. And I said, I remember everything that you did last night. I remember everything. How could you do that? And he started freaking out, saying stuff like, I'm not that kind of guy, no one will believe you, oh my god, I won't do it in the future. All these different things, contradictory to each other. But the one that stuck with me was the, I'm not that kind of guy, because he isn't. Or wasn't, from what I understood.
Who is a rapist? What does a rapist look like or sound like? Or there's still this idea that somewhere there's a profile, right? And so and somebody either looks like it or feels like it or sounds like it, or they don't. And it's just not true.
In terms of the nice guy narrative, I think college campuses make it even more difficult to identify people as perpetrators.
So often I think we have the sense that, like our schools are perfect. They're sort of like these safe havens, these bubbles from the real world, which means that people here couldn't be assailants, couldn't be abusive. And the reality is people on these campuses were abusive and are abusive and will continue to be abusive.
This is one of our students. And so that's why I think oftentimes there's an assumption going in that if something happened here, it must have been there's sort of a confluence of very unfortunate factors, and because he wouldn't really do this otherwise. And if he did something wrong, then it's because of all these situational factors that unfortunately came together that night. It's not to say that that doesn't happen. Of course, I'm sure that happens. It happens, I'm sure plenty of times. But we also know the statistics tell us that many times that's not what happens.
Most sexual assault involves people who already know each other. It involves a certain amount of intoxication occurring, oftentimes as a way of the perpetrator getting away with sexual assault.
The date rape drug of choice is not Rufinol, it's alcohol. People think that sexual assault is somehow the byproduct of binge drinking, of hookup culture, of party culture, when it's not. It is the product of someone not asking for or caring about consent.
It's not alcohol that makes people rape, right? Just like how we hold people who commit DUIs accountable for their actions when they're drunk, people should be held accountable if they rape while they're drunk.
One of the myths is that only women get assaulted, and that's absolutely not true. Anyone can be a perpetrator, anyone can be a victim in that situation. It was the 6th night of college for me. It was still orientation, and I was hanging out with friends and enjoying myself, and we just had one of those nights where you're talking with people until 5 in the morning. Then they went to sleep, and I was like, okay, well, I should probably go to bed now. And on the walk between my room and the restroom, I crossed paths with someone, and then I sort of walked into the communal restroom, and then I hear a knock on the door, and so I opened the door, and it was him. And I go back to the sink, and he says, well, you're really hot. And I sort of turned around and was like, oh, that's nice of you, but it's 5 in the morning, I'm about to go to bed. And he said, come on, no one has to know. And took a step towards me and grabbed my crotch and then started pushing me into one of the bathroom stalls. I just completely froze because here I was, I had just gotten onto a college campus. Like, is this how college people interact with one another? Is this what they do? So I just didn't know how to respond. At the time, I just sort of passed it off as like, okay, like I was in control of it. Yeah, like I hooked up with someone in the bathroom. Oh, that wasn't my classiest. Sort of tried to push away how I was really feeling about it. And then that sort of worked because I didn't see him very often on campus, but when I would feel myself getting tenser. I felt my heartbeat get faster, my blood pressure rise. My vision started narrowing down to what was right in front of me and just sort of feeling this very sort of like, get out, get out, get out. And desperately trying to keep him from looking at me or acknowledging me or touching me or anything like that. I think that a lot of male survivors don't come forward because of a lot of the reasons that I didn't come forward for a long time, which is that this is supposed to be something that's so humiliating to men.
This fear that you're performing your masculinity incorrectly, that you are not as masculine, that you are not as manly, that you are not sort of a real man, if you admit that harm is being done to you or has been done to you.
There's also gender identity, so it's not even just, if you're male or female, but if you're identify as trans or genderqueer, or you're just generally gender nonconforming, there's other barriers to accessing resources, maybe administrators saying really ignorant things. So all of those sort of things you have to keep in account when we're talking about campus sexual assault.
Early on during my first year of college, I was coming to a realization that I was not straight. And that ended up leading to me entering a relationship with a much older student. I had never dated a man before. I'd never dated a queer person before. And I sort of thought that the way that he was treating me was normal. That was what happened when two queer people dated. That was what happened in a relationship. That's what happened in a college relationship. He controlled me. He wouldn't let me talk to my friends. He, put me down. He put my friends down. He limited what I could do socially. He controlled my behavior. He was erratic around me. And then my last night of my freshman year, he grabbed me and held me down against my will, and wouldn't let me leave until I told him that I loved him. And I couldn't get away, and so I told him that I loved him. And then finally he let me go. My first night back for my sophomore year, I got way too drunk because it was my first night back of my sophomore year, and that's what happens. You celebrate with friends, and he raped me again. He was actually led into my room by my RA under the guise of helping me because I was blackout drunk and throwing up. And instead of helping me, he ended up raping me. Through that story, I sort of saw that what happened to me was not legitimate in the eyes of a lot of people. I was drinking. It was with someone that I knew. It was with someone that I told I loved. It was with someone I was in a relationship with.
I think too often we look at the relationship that people have between one another as proof of whether rape happened or not. And I think that's, the basis of us thinking it's about strangers, but it's actually really what happened at that time and moment. And we really need to acknowledge that, unfortunately, yes, people in relationships do get raped by their partners.
About 2 weeks after this happened to me, after I was raped, I ended up trying to kill myself and was hospitalized for a little under a week at a hospital a few miles away from here. I was told by administrators that the issue was my drinking. I was told that I shouldn't be allowed to come back to campus because I was going to be a danger to myself and others. I was not this perfect victim, and so what happened to me was seen as less valid, as less damaging.
There are a lot of things at play there, I think, that make people feel that their experiences aren't valid.
From my experience, it took me a very long time from when I was in the bathroom right after to a few months later before I even considered what happened to me as assault. I'm shocked how many people tell me it took them a few months to really wrap their head around what happened to them, and it's sort of making me realize that that's not the aberration, that's more the norm.
In the last several years, there have been a number of studies looking at specifically asking people who have had these kinds of experiences and asking them, so did you report and did you not report, and if you did not report, can you tell us why? And so we know from those studies that one of the most common responses is, I didn't report because I didn't think it was important or serious enough. And when you think about that, you think about this person, this could be male or female, let's take gender out of it, has reported to you, has answered a question that indicates that they experienced something that we say as a society is a criminal act, it's a sexual assault. And they don't think that that's important enough to report. That's a pretty, just sit with that for a moment.
So I really see it as largely coming from media and how it depicts or doesn't depict sexual assault.
If you don't see yourself reflected in the media surrounding an issue, then you start to question whether or not your experience is valid.
I think it really depicts a certain type of victim that people may feel, I don't fit that stereotype, so I must not be a victim.
Like, I remember seeing people like the people who are still on TV, who are still in these news stories, when I was looking for reason, when I was looking for meaning for what happened to me, and I felt alone and lost and confused.
It's hard for me to sort of look online or look on TV, look, in all sorts of media and not see experiences like mine or people like me.
So there were a couple of times when I started speaking publicly where I would get really close to getting an interview and I would end up not getting it, and it would go to a straight cisgender white woman.
I would talk to media people and I would tell them my story, and a lot of times people would find that my story is like quote unquote too complicated, just because I was in a relationship with my assailant and it was abusive and it was on and off. So there's this idea that we need to have this sort of really clean-cut, straightforward story.
And I saw this happen over and over again, and I saw it happen to my friends who I've met through this movement who are women of color, who are queer women of color, who are trans people of color.
One producer, he really was into the idea of having the pictures of the perpetrators included, and I remember when I finally watched the segment and they showed the assailants. I obviously was passed up, I wasn't included, but the people they showed were black men, so there was also this dynamic of like the only people who sort of look like me that when we're talking about this issue are the assailants.
I was told by one reporter for a major television station that maybe later they would do a piece on more alternative voices. To be told that your voice is alternative means that it's like less worthy of being heard. And that was a really, really hard thing to hear.
I definitely believe that rape culture is a thing, and it's really alive and well.
Rape culture is everywhere, even when we don't realize it. It's in media, it's in music, it's in books, it's in our conversations with our friends, even when we aren't aware of it. Whether that's through joking about sexual assault, like it's not a problem. For example, that test raped me, something people say, and really there you're not taking sexual assault seriously. Or assuming sexual assault is just a bad hookup or someone who regrets sex and reports it to the police for revenge. Those things are rape culture because they're not taking sexual assault seriously. They're treating it as about sex and not about power and violating someone else's space and body.
I see the concrete consequences of rape culture both in the rapists that I have interviewed and studied and in the victims that I have worked with. So the rapists have internalized these aspects of the culture such that they don't see what they're doing as rape.
I definitely think sometimes assailants don't think what they're doing is rape. I think that's why education is really important, because we just don't talk about the different manifestations of sexual violence, and a lot of people think what they do is okay.
It's not as though these students magically spawned onto college campuses. They had middle school and high school to learn about sexual education and what it's like to be in a healthy relationship or consent, and they haven't been.
A Tuesday night in the fall of senior year of high school, my friend, who I'd been friends with for a few months, texted me and asked me to hang out. So I went out, met up with him and his friends who were smoking, so I didn't want to sit near them. And so we sat on a bench about 15 feet away from them, I would guess, and he at first just kept trying to kiss me, and I said no, and like put my hand over my mouth and turned away. Reminded him he had a girlfriend, just kept saying no, and he kept saying like, come on. And eventually I just distracted him, I thought, like with conversation about something else, and then there was kind of a long pause and he asked for a ride home, and I felt like, okay, this has been pretty uncomfortable, yeah, like let's leave, I'm ready to go. And we left and we walked to my car, and when we got in my car, he threw me in the back seat and assaulted me there.
now we have a culture of silence and stigma. We need a culture of support and healing on our campuses. We have to change the way in which we react to sexual assault and domestic violence, and then the way that the media represents it. You have to start acting as though you live in the world that you wish was here.